Serene Damaki with you on evenings on ABC Radio, filling in for Christine Anu. Hope your Friday night's going awesome. What are your vices? What are those things that you need to give up but just can't? Coffee would be it for me. But then again, I don't want to give up coffee. I love coffee. But a lot of us seem to think that when we like something too much, it might be because we have an addictive personality. Well, our next guest questions whether there is such a thing. So to tell us more, we're joined by Stephen Bright, who is a senior lecturer of addiction at Edith Cowan University. Hello, Stephen.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Great to talk to you. What traditionally is an addictive personality?
Well, we often think of this idea of an addictive personality. You know, we all know somebody who tends to engage in an excessive behaviour, and if they sort of curb that vice, then they tend to engage in something else quite excessively. However, the evidence is that there's not really, there isn't really this thing that we think is an addictive personality. So rather, if people are engaging in an excessive behaviour, it might be because there's something underlying. So, for example, somebody who's quite lonely might find themselves engaging excessively in online gaming, where they're able to get that social connection and also a sense of prestige as they game for a period of time and gain some respect in the gaming world. If somebody engages in excessive shopping, it could be covering up some existential angst, or some people that engage excessively in substance use often have underlying trauma or other mental health issues.
You're making me think of, as you're talking, you're making me think of habit and biting my nails. So those are the two things as you were describing as you were describing that, you made me think of that. Is there a difference there in terms of habit and what you've just defined there?
I'm not sure, actually. You raise a good point. I think there's an overlap between habits and things we might do excessively. So you could bite your nails and you could realise that, you don't like it because you like your fingernails to be nice, and consequently you can make a concerted effort not to bite your nails or try not to do it too excessively. However, some people find that they bite their nails very excessively and they're unable to control what they're doing. So when people are unable to control that behaviour anymore, it goes beyond being a habit and becomes an addictive behaviour.
Yeah, interesting. And that's kind of because I don't bite my nails excessively. I used to as a kid, but I can say that it hasn't entirely gone away, and sometimes there'll be a spike maybe if I'm watching a really good movie or a show that I'm into, and then my husband always sits next to me going, "Stop biting your nails." And I'm like, "Oh yes, darn it, that's right, I need to stop biting my nails." So that's interesting, Stephen. So what do psychologists mean when referring to personality?
So personality is stable and enduring traits. So there's 5 common personality features that we often measure. So whether people are neurotic or not, whether they're extroverted or introverted, whether they're conscientious, whether they're open to new ideas, and how agreeable they are. So those tend to be the dimensions that we consider to be personality. And so some of those dimensions, like extroversion or neuroticism, tend to be associated with people engaging in excessive behaviours and not being able to control those excessive behaviours, or the excessive behaviours' impact on their daily functioning. So the example you gave with biting your nails, it's not actually impacting on your daily functioning, and it probably wasn't even as a kid. So it was just a habit that sort of hadn't got out of control.
Yeah, until one got infected, but yes.
Well, it might have got a little bit out of control.
A little bit.
But some people find it very difficult with those very simple behaviours like, biting your fingernails. And I guess what you described is very common. It's actually a type of impulse control disorder. People will also sometimes pull out hair, and there's other sort of interesting behaviours that people will do. Often when they often don't realise that they're doing it, like you sort of described, or when they're under tremendous amounts of stress.
So what you're talking about, neuroticism, how does it relate to a personality dimension?
So people that are neurotic find it difficult to manage their emotions, and consequently they might experience problems with depression, with anxiety, obsessive-compulsive disorder, or also substance use disorders. So as a way of managing the emotion, people find that substances are very good at managing moods. So if you're feeling a bit down, having a drink in the short term at least might lift your mood, or another substance might lift that mood. Similarly, if you're very anxious, a substance can reliably change your mood. However, in the long term, it's not a very effective strategy because it might lead to substance dependence or other problems associated with substance use.
So what are the big 5 personality dimensions?
The big 5 are the neuroticism, extroversion, introversion, conscientiousness, openness, and agreeableness. So some of these have been, so it's only really neuroticism and extroversion that have been associated with addictive behaviours, but some of the other ones have been associated with other behaviours. And in fact, we usually think of personality as a very stable concept, but some things, like yoga, for example, have been shown to increase people's level of openness to new experiences. So there are things that we can do that might actually change our personality.
What are addictive behaviours? Do they relate to personality, and how do they relate?
Well, there may be certain genetic features that might increase the likelihood of addictive behaviours. So really, I actually don't like the term addiction, even though I teach a course called Addiction Studies.
It's in your title, Senior Lecturer of Addiction.
It's sort of an antiquated concept, and sort of I would like over time to sort of even change the way the university recognises that, because addiction is quite black and white. We think of someone as that they're either addicted or not, and it can be quite stigmatising as well. So to call somebody an addict is not particularly helpful in terms of them changing their behaviour. In fact, it leads to stigma, and they're less likely to seek help.
Yeah. What other term? Do you have another term that you would?
Sure. I prefer the term dependent. So you can be dependent on substances, objects, activities, and people, and dependence is actually normal. It's normal to be dependent to varying degrees on different things in our life. However, it can become pathological if that dependence becomes so great that you experience significant distress in the absence of that substance, object, activity, or person.
If you've just joined us, you're with me, Serene Damaki, on Evenings on ABC Radio. I'm speaking with Stephen Bright, a Senior Lecturer of Addiction at Edith Cowan University, and we're talking about, I don't want to use the word addictive personality anymore, Stephen, because we don't want to go dependent and not, well, looking at the word addictive and looking at the word personality, and more that they don't necessarily belong together, but just looking at those behaviours in us that make us dependent on things, and what does that look like when it comes to our personalities. Stephen, can having an addictive personality be related to genetics? Yeah,
so I guess there are certain genes that increase people's likelihood of experiencing problems with excessive behaviours.
Okay.
And so in particular, there's 5 genes that are linked to the way the brain produces dopamine. And dopamine is a motivational neurotransmitter. It sometimes gets called erroneously the pleasure neurotransmitter. It's not really. It's more of a thing that motivates us. And so our brain releases dopamine when we eat sugary foods or salty foods or engage in sexual behaviours. It releases dopamine to reinforce those behaviours which have an evolutionary, there's an evolutionary reason for those behaviours. So if people's brains produce lower levels of dopamine, they tend to seek out sensations that are going to release dopamine. So to say these genes the addiction personality genes would be a bit like saying the genes for height are the basketball genes. Some people may be tall, but they might not like basketball. They might not be exposed to basketball depending on the environment that they grow up in. And similarly, people that experience the variance of these dopamine genes that mean they tend to be more sensation-seeking may never develop any problems with addiction. However, they may develop a passion for skydiving or rock climbing or any of those adrenaline sports.
Any other genes that are related to addiction?
There's genes that increase the likelihood of experiencing that sort of neurotic dimension of personality. So there's definitely good evidence that there's a genetic basis to that dimension. And as you sort of mentioned, that dimension tends to be associated with an increased propensity to develop addictive behaviours, because people are looking for ways to self-soothe, because people high neuroticism find it very difficult to self-soothe.
Okay. Interesting. How does it work? Like, how would someone become addicted to something? Can they avoid becoming addicted to things? I know there are a couple of questions in there, but again, I'm relating it to, I mentioned my biting my nails, and my 6-year-old daughter kind of does the same every now and again. So you could only imagine my reaction to that. I'm like, no, I don't want her to, pick up this bad habit the way I sort of did. And so, yeah, how does it work?
Well, I think what you described there is actually really important, because it highlights that there probably is a genetic basis to it. We're not at a level where we fully understand the genes that predispose people to these particular behaviours. I mean, it could be modelling. She might have seen you biting your nails at some point and picked it up, but it's highly likely that there's a genetic component to it. And so for people that are genetically predisposed to develop problems with excessive behaviours, ideally, being aware of that can be helpful, and potentially avoiding things that might lead to a problem with addiction.
Yeah. Are there people... Yeah, go on. No, sorry.
I was just going to say, I guess, in addition to that, because we don't all know what our genetic background is, and in many respects, I don't think it's helpful sometimes to focus on the genetics so much, because there's not much we can do about our genes, but there are things we can do about the environment. So we know that from a sociological perspective, if people feel socially included, then they're less likely to develop substance use problems. We know that if people feel like they've got meaning and purpose in life, then they're less likely to experience problems. And in addition to that, it's normal for young people, particularly adolescents, to experiment with different behaviours. And so, we see young people experimenting with drugs at festivals, and most don't develop problems with drugs. Most are just experimenting with it. It's a normal part of growing up. They're pushing the envelope like all young people do.
Sure.
I guess as people get a bit older, if they're noticing that they're starting to sort of fall down a slippery slope, if they're noticing that the behaviour is starting to impact on their life, it's starting to impact on significant others, they're getting sort of warning signs, then there's absolutely things that people can do to help them make a behaviour change and avoid them sort of developing an excessive behaviour that becomes problematic.
So what's the verdict, Stephen? Do you think an addictive personality exists?
Not at all. I don't think there is an addictive personality. I think we like to think of that because it makes intuitive sense. We kind of seem to see it, but the science doesn't support it. And in fact, by saying the person has an addictive personality, it might be a bit of a throwaway line, when in fact the behaviours that they're exhibiting may be actually symptomatic of something far more serious that would be more important for us to focus on.
Tell me about some of the research you're doing or you've done in this area.
Most of my research has actually been looking at all kinds of interesting things, not necessarily directly related to addiction. At the moment, I'm looking at pill testing in young people at festivals, and sort of whether or not pill testing might increase people's perception that it's okay to use drugs. I look at synthetic cannabis and drug laws around that. And
this is from this is from a psychological perspective, yes?
Correct, yeah. And one of the most interesting things I think I've looked at fairly recently is the concept of microdosing. So we're seeing more and more people taking sub-threshold doses of psychedelic drugs to improve their cognitive performance. And
sorry, Stephen. I'm going to go, this is probably me and what do you mean by microdosing?
Sure. So microdosing is taking a sub-threshold, so a very low dose of a psychedelic drug, with the idea of improving performance, improving a person's cognition, improving their ability to function at work, essentially improving their ability to stay in a mindful state, to reduce anxiety. And so there's not a lot of research that's actually been done empirically to sort of look at clinical trials of this. So we surveyed some 600 Australians to get some data on them and their personality. And one of the things we found was that people that microdose tend to have an increased level of openness. So it's not clear whether microdosing, like yoga, actually increases that openness or not, but certainly we saw that the people that were microdosing had high levels of openness compared to those that didn't.
Openness,
what was
you're
really
saying?
interesting is it also led to increased levels of neuroticism.
Right. Okay. And you said that they're openness
Yeah.
in terms of their personality.
Yeah, so they're open to new ideas, and it makes
Okay.
people that are open to new ideas are more likely to microdose, but there's actually evidence that people who have taken a psychedelic drug in the context of psychotherapy and clinical research that's only been conducted in the last few years actually do have high levels of openness afterwards. So, in terms of yoga is one way people might increase their levels of openness, and psychedelics in the context, of course, of psychotherapy, obviously sanctioned clinical use, has also been shown to increase people's openness.
Stephen, you're a senior lecturer specialising in addiction or dependability, as you'd suggested you'd prefer, I suppose, the term. How did you first get into this area of psychology?
To be honest, I didn't come into it straight after Year 12. I guess when I was in Year 12, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. I went out and worked and lived life and saw people around me experiencing problems with substance use, and I wanted to find out what was causing people to experience problems with substance use and what I might be able to do for people to help them to prevent either them engaging in problematic substance use or treating them when they were experiencing problems with that behaviour.
Well, great, because that's what I was keen to hear from you, some insights on some ways people who might have either the addiction genes or along those lines of what we've been talking about tonight, be able to manage these symptoms.
Yeah, sure. There's
like my nail biting, Stephen.
Nail biting is actually believe it or not, nail biting is actually one of the most difficult ones to treat.
Oh,
because
thanks.
Because it's something you do when you're often not aware of it. When you're aware of what you're doing, you won't be biting your nails. It's when you, like you say, when you're watching a good movie, you're getting engrossed in the movie and you're not really concentrating, and that's when you start to bite your nails.
Yeah.
And so it's actually called an impulse control disorder rather than an addiction, because it's an impulse that you're not aware that you're having, and you find it very difficult to control. Whereas other behaviours like substance use, shopping, gaming, there's good evidence that psychological treatments can be effective for helping people to manage some of those problems, and in particular an approach called cognitive behavioural therapy, which helps people understand how their thinking about their situation affects their emotions, how their emotions affect their behaviour, and how they might be able to change their behaviour and their thoughts to be able to better manage their emotions.
It has been so wonderful speaking with you, Stephen. Thanks so much for the not just the insights, but also just a wealth of information, and even looking at this word addiction and personality in from very many different perspectives. Thank you for your time.
Thanks so much for having me.
That was Stephen Bright, a senior lecturer of addiction at Edith Cowan University. Okay, so my nail biting, not so much, more along the lines of an impulsive behaviour and probably not even noticing that I'm doing it. And I've just got to keep working on it. I just hope that my little one doesn't kind of grow up with the same habit. Let's hear a track. Here's Rule with Face to Face.